A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, abridged by the author and adapted by Forfar Dramatic Society. Stave 3, the second of the three spirits.
Scrooge awoke in his bedroom. There was no doubt about that. But it, and his own adjoining sitting room, into which he shuffled in his slippers, attracted by a great light there, had undergone a surprising transformation.
The walls and ceiling were so hung with living green that it looked a perfect grove.
The leaves of holly, mistletoe and ivy reflected back the light, as if many little mirrors had been scattered there.
Such a mighty blaze went roaring up the chimney, as that petrification of a hearth had never known in Scrooge's time, or Marley's, or for many and many a winter season gone.
Heaped upon the floor to form a kind of throne were turkeys, geese, game, brawn, great joints of meat, sucking pigs, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, red-hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, immense twelfth cakes, and great bowls of punch.
In easy state upon this couch there sat a giant, glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch, in shape not unlike Plenty's horn, and who raised it high to shed its light on Scrooge as he came peeping round the door.
Come in, and know me better, man. I am the ghost of Christmas present. Look upon me. You have never seen the like of me before.
Never.
Have never walked with the younger members of my family, meaning, for I am very young, my elder brothers born in these late years?
I don't think I have. I am afraid I have not. Have you had many brothers, Spirit?
More than 1800.
A tremendous family to provide for, Spirit. Conduct me where you will. I went forth last night on compulsion and I learned a lesson which is working now. Tonight, if you have aught to teach me, let me profit by it.
Touch my robe.
The room and its contents all vanished instantly, and they stood in the city streets upon a snowy Christmas morning.
Scrooge and the ghost passed on, invisible, straight to Scrooge's clerk, and on the threshold of the door the spirit smiled, and stopped to bless Bob Cratchit's dwelling with the sprinklings of his torch.
Think of that! Bob had but 15 bob a week himself, he pocketed on Saturdays, but 15 copies of his Christian name, and yet the ghost of Christmas present blessed his 4-roomed house.
Then up rose Mrs. Cratchit, Cratchit's wife, dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown, brave in ribbons, which are cheap and make a goodly show for sixpence.
She laid the cloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, also brave in ribbons, while Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into the saucepan of potatoes.
And now 2 smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they had smelt the goose and known it for their own.
Basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion, these young Cratchits danced about the table and exalted Master Peter Cratchit to the skies, while he blew the fire, until the slow potatoes, bubbling up, knocked loudly at the saucepan lid to be let out and peeled.
What has ever got your precious father, then? And your brother Tiny Tim? And Martha weren't as late last Christmas Day by half an hour.
Here's Martha, Mother.
Here's Martha. Ah! There's such a goose, Martha. Hey, Martha.
Why, bless your heart alive, my dear. How late you are.
We did a deal of work to finish up last night and had to clear away this morning,
Well,
Mother.
never mind so long as you come. Sit you down before the fire, my dear, and have a warm. Lord bless you.
No, here's Father coming.
So Martha hid herself, and in came little Bob, the father, with at least 3 feet of comforter, exclusive of the fringe, hanging down before him,
his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed to look seasonable,
and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch and had his limbs supported by an iron frame.
Why, where's our Martha?
Not coming.
Not coming? Not coming upon Christmas Day?
Martha didn't like to see him disappointed, if it were only in joke, so she came out prematurely from behind the closet door and ran into his arms.
The 2 young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off to the wash-house that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper.
And how did little Tim behave?
As good as gold, and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful, sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me, coming home, that he hoped the people saw him in the church, because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember, upon Christmas Day, who made lame beggars walk and blind men see.
Bob's voice was tremulous when he told them this, and trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty.
His active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to his stool beside the fire.
And Bob, turning up his cuffs as if, poor fellow, they were capable of being made more shabby, compounded some hot mixture in a jug with gin and lemons, and stirred it round and round and put it on the hob to simmer.
Master Peter and the two ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession.
Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy hissing hot.
Master Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigour.
Miss Belinda sweetened up the apple sauce.
Martha dusted the hot plates.
Bob took Tiny Tim beside him in a tiny corner at the table.
Two young Cratchits set chairs for everybody, not forgetting themselves, and mounting guard upon their posts, crammed spoons into their mouths, lest they should shriek for goose before their turn came to be helped.
At last the dishes were set on, and grace was said.
It was succeeded by a breathless pause, as Mrs. Cratchit, looking slowly all along the carving knife, prepared to plunge it in the breast. But when she did, and when the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight arose all round the board, and even Tiny Tim, excited by the two young Cratchits, beat on the table with the handle of his knife and feebly cried, "Hurrah!"
I don't believe there ever was such a goose cooked, Mrs. Cratchit. So tender and flavoursome, and so big for the price. Why, with the apple sauce and mashed potatoes, it's a grand dinner for us all.
Indeed. Why, look, we're all full and yet haven't eaten at all. I think the little ones are steeped in sage and onions to the eyebrows. Now, I'll go and fetch the pudding while Belinda changes the plate, shall I? You be careful now, that's the good china.
Suppose it should be not done enough.
Suppose it should be break and turn it out.
Suppose somebody should have got over the wall of the backyard and stolen it while we were merry with the goose.
Hello, a great deal of steam.
Pudding was out of the copper, a smell like a washing day.
That was the cloth.
A smell like an eating house and a pastry cook's next door to each other, with a laundress's next door to that.
That was the pudding.
In half a minute, Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed but smiling proudly with the pudding.
A speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in half a quartern of ignited brandy, and bedight with Christmas holly stuck into the top.
Oh, a wonderful pudding! I regard this pudding as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since our marriage.
Well, now the weight is off my mind. I would confess I had my doubts about the quantity of flour.
No, it's a perfect size for all.
At last the dinner was done.
The cloth was cleared.
The hearth swept and the fire made up.
Compound in the jug being tasted and considered perfect. Apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovelful of chestnuts on the fire.
Then all the Cratchit family drew around the hearth in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, and at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers, and a custard cup without a handle.
These held the hot stuff from the jug, however, as well as golden goblets would have done, and Bob served it out with beaming looks, while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and crackled noisily.
A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us.
Merry Christmas,
Merry
all.
Christmas all.
God bless us, everyone.
He sat very close to his father's side upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his, as if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side, and dreaded that he might be taken from him.
Mr. Scrooge. I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast.
The founder of the feast, indeed. I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I'd hope he'd have a good appetite for it.
My dear, the children. Christmas Day.
It should be Christmas Day, I am sure, on which one drinks the health of such a odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do. Poor fellow.
My dear, Christmas Day.
I'll drink his health for your sake and the day's, not for his. Long life to him, a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. He'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt.
The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of their proceedings which had no heartiness in it. Tiny Tim drank it last of all, but he didn't care 2p for it.
Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for full 5 minutes.
After it had passed away, they were 10 times merrier than before, from the mere relief of Scrooge the Baleful being done with.
There was nothing of high mark in this. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof. Their clothes were scanty. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another and contented with the time.
And when they faded and looked happier yet in the bright sprinklings of the Spirit's torch at parting, Scrooge had his eye upon them, and especially on Tiny Tim, until the last.
It was a great surprise to Scrooge, as the scene vanished, to hear a hearty laugh. It was a much greater surprise to Scrooge to recognise it as his own nephew's, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room with the Spirit standing smiling by his side and looking at that same nephew.
It is a fair, even-handed, noble adjustment of things, that while there is infection and disease and sorrow, there is nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humour.
When Scrooge's nephew laughed, Scrooge's niece by marriage laughed as heartily as he, and their assembled friends, being not a bit behindhand, laughed out lustily.
He said that Christmas was a humbug, as I live. He believed it too.
More shame for him, Fred.
He's a comical old fellow, that's the truth, and not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offences carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him. Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself. Always. Here he takes it into his head to dislike us, and he won't come and dine with us. What's the consequence? He don't lose much of a dinner.
Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner.
After tea they had some music, for they were a musical family and knew what they were about when they sung a glee or catch, I can assure you. But they didn't devote the whole evening to music.
It was a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something and the rest must find out what. He only answering their questions yes or no, as the case was.
The fire of questioning to which he was exposed elicited from him that he was thinking of an animal.
A live animal.
Rather a disagreeable animal.
A savage animal.
An animal that growled and grunted sometimes and talked sometimes.
And lived in London and walked about the streets and wasn't made a show of.
And wasn't led by anybody and didn't live in a menagerie and was never killed in a market.
And was not a horse.
Or an ass.
Or a cow or a bull.
Or a tiger or a dog.
Or a pig. Or a cat.
Or a bear.
At every new question put to him, this nephew burst into a fresh roar of laughter and was so inexpressibly tickled that he was obliged to get up off the sofa and stamp.
Oh, I found it out. I know what it is, Fred. I know what it is. It's your Uncle Scrooge.
Which it certainly was.
Admiration was the sentiment, though some objected that the reply to, "Is it a bear?" ought to have been yes.
Uncle Scrooge had imperceptibly become so gay and light of heart that he would have drank to the unconscious company in an inaudible speech, but the whole scene passed off in the breath of the last words spoken by his nephew, and he and the Spirit were again upon their travels.
Much they saw, and far they went, and many homes they visited, but always with a happy end.
The Spirit stood beside sick beds, and they were cheerful.
On foreign lands, and they were close at home.
By struggling men, and they were patient in their greater hope.
By poverty, and it was
in
rich.
In almshouse, hospital, and jail.
In misery's every refuge, where vain man in his little brief authority had not made fast the door and barred the Spirit out, he left his blessing, and taught Scrooge his precepts.
Suddenly, as they stood together in an open place, the bell struck 12.
Scrooge looked about him for the ghost and saw it no more.
As the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley and, lifting up his eyes, beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground towards him.
That was Stave 3 of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, abridged by the author and adapted by Forfar Dramatic Society.